In 1603, Ireland was ablaze with violence. There was hardly an acre of the country which hadn't been visited by murder and mayhem. For 10 years, the Irish under O'Neill and O'Donnell had waged rebellion against the English. But now, the crunch had come. The Battle of Kinsale, in which the English had defeated the Irish and the Spanish on Christmas Day 1601, had left the Irish chieftains scattered to the four winds. O'Neill and his northern force melted away home, and O'Sullivan Beara went west to his Beara stronghold. After the Battle of Kinsale, Dunboy Castle was besieged by the English forces. They took it, blew it up, and then massacred the population of Dursey Island a few miles away. O'Sullivan Beara wasn't home when the English came calling. He was further afield, raiding amongst the Irish who had taken the English shilling.
When they took the forts, they massacred all the soldiers that were on board, and then, in addition, they massacred every man, woman and child that they could find on the island. According to Don Philip, there were 300 in all. And they threw them over the cliff in a place called Oit un Oir, the place of the massacre.
We have descriptions of everybody, including women, children, being butchered, put to the sword and displayed to each other by the soldiers with babies impaled on swords and so on. That's the description that we have. But we sadly have to take into account, of course, that there were Irish factions involved there and there was revenge being handed out from one side to the other. So the story is never as simple as we think.
Dunboy Castle was destroyed and O'Sullivan Beara wintered at Glengariff. But the English encircled the Irish again, leaving him with some stark choices. A retreat involving up to 1,000 people was the obvious answer. But could this be done in the depths of winter?
They had nothing to live on. There was nothing but starvation ahead of them. On top of that, the English were closing in on all sides. From the north, from the east, and from the west, they were just squeezing him, and the only way he could run was north.
It's 400 years later, to the day, and up to 100 people have gathered in O'Sullivan country to reenact the march to Leitrim. And with the words of Deirdre Purcell, the writer, reminding them of other forced marches, they prepare to set out.
And all I will say to you all is may you not get blisters, may the skies remain clear, may the wind remain warm at your back, and may the spirit of the O'Sullivans light you on your way.
The solemn procedure of putting clan rings on the tribal staffs is enough to bond them, bending their thoughts to the past, when their descendants froze to death, were attacked by other clans, and ultimately faced the unknown. It was a steep climb out of Glengariff, then across bogland, with foot-deep snowdrifts leading down into the Cumhola Valley. They ran and stumbled through the night.
I think one of the great epics in history. I think of it as the same as the Spartans at the pass at Thermopylae and the Jewish people at Masada. Just a great, something probably should be better known in Irish history.
On the night that he left Glengariff to go north, he left wounded people and ill people behind at the camp. And when Wilmot and his soldiers came down, they killed every one of them. So that was what lay in store for him if he stayed behind, if he and his people stayed behind. You must remember that basically the wars of Elizabeth were wars of extermination. They wanted to get the Irish out, bring English in, and colonise the whole country.
It's said that the first casualty was an infant, buried in an ancient cairn of stone, still known locally as Uigan Linnev, the child's grave. Aughris was a pilgrimage site even in those days when they sheltered overnight, and the route north was the pilgrimage route from here to Ardpatrick and from there to Slieve Felim and on to the Shannon. They were off again, heading for the next shrine, that of St. Gubnet, a 7th century woman with both curative and destructive powers. Just a year or so before O'Sullivan Beara passed this way, Pope Clement VIII imparted a special blessing for travellers who visited here. This shrine and the rather startling Sheila na Gig carving enhanced Gubnet's reputation throughout Ireland. Ahead of them lay Malachanish, a mountainy area which was particularly dangerous in the blizzard-like conditions. But more ominously, O'Sullivan Beara was about to discover that almost every Irish chieftain through whose land they passed would attack them and harry them at every step. As they forded the Salone River, they were ambushed by the McCarthys, and for several hours both sides exchanged fire. O'Sullivan Beara shook off his pursuers eventually, but at a cost. Much of his baggage was lost, though not his gold. When they got to the Ower Moor, or the Blackwater River, they crossed over using steps that were there for many centuries before. And they did so under the gaze of the O'Keefes on one side and the McCarthys on the other. But for once, both these slept soundly.
We've two staffs with us. One is the one of all the towns gone through. Military was put on last night, so we just want the O'Keefes to be put on this morning.
Ardpatrick rises 400 feet above the Glen of Aherlow. They camped here overnight in freezing conditions. Several died from exposure, but there was no let-up. O'Sullivan Beara drove them on, keeping a watchful eye for marauders. They were very exposed to attack now. And an attack did come, a big one this time. The White Knight from Limerick pursued them all day long and inflicted heavy losses on the marches near Galbally. That day, people died on their feet, lost in swirling snow. The protection of the Slieve Felim Mountains lay ahead of them, but first they had to eat. They raided one of the largest granaries in Munster at that time, the moat at Donohill. They gorged themselves for a full 3 hours.
When O'Sullivan Beara came through, he would obviously have been aware of the fact that this was a place that food would be available. Now, they had been very badly treated by our neighbours in Solohead, and it is said they had lived off the bark of trees and leaves for 4 days previously. So once they approached Donohill here, they made a very, very determined effort to to capture the castle, which they did seemingly without an awful struggle. And we're told that the first of the besiegers who entered the castle fell upon the food that had been prepared and devoured it forthwith. Those who came in after them started eating the raw grain.
As they struggled to reach Slieve Felim, their way was blocked at Capawhite. More bloodshed, more mayhem. But they survived, and the marching column began the task of picking its way through icy, mountainy terrain. The modern-day marchers fared better than their forebears. Warm mugs of tea, hot soup, and words of encouragement were the order of the day, and a soft bed as the short winter's day ended. The monks of Lura at the northern end of Lough Derg turned a blind eye and ignored the warnings of MacEgan, the High Sheriff of Tipperary, to shun the marchers and offer them no aid.
The O'Sullivans through here, you got a hard time. Yeah. We'd like to
This was where MacEgan lived, and he was an English sheriff, and he would have had control of this area. And when the O'Sullivans came to cross the Shannon down here below at the ford, White's Ford as it is known, they would have to go through MacEgan's territory. And MacEgan, as we said, was loyal to the English at that time, and he would have been looking over his shoulder at the English and proving to them that he was loyal, and as such attacking the O'Sullivans on their way to the Shannon. He couldn't stand by and allow them idly to go by.
The biggest challenge facing them now was crossing the Shannon, but when they got there were no boats.
History of the O'Sullivan Beara and the march across the Shannon is something that I've heard of since I was a youngster, from all of the people around here, and they still point out as if that walk took place only yesterday.
On the 6th day of January, the clan camped beside the great lordly Shannon, flowing deeply and wide. Too wide for last, no boat could they find, while the enemy's forces approached from behind. Were they caught in a trap, where could they go? The river before them, behind them the foe.
O'Sullivan Beara ordered the able-bodied to cut down trees and build a trench around their camp. Dermot O'Sullivan from Dursey managed to build a corrock, and the Burkes from Connacht constructed a coracle.
Where we're standing now is normally flooded. So it would have been very easy to get right to the side of the river, you know, and it was easy to defend as well because it's just a strip of ground, you know, going out, and it's just one side to defend as well from attack. So it's been an ideal spot, really.
But this task was not complete without some outer covering for the boats. O'Sullivan Beara's solution was brilliant but brutal. They killed 7 of their horses and used their skin. At daybreak, they launched the boats from the spot still known today as Paul na Gupple. MacEgan attacked midway through the ferrying operation, driving many of the women to a watery grave. Of the 400 soldiers who had left Glengarriff over a week ago, 120 were dead. Many of the non-combatants had died. Some others just refused to march another step and were given a few gold coins to help persuade some of the locals to give them shelter. To this day, their descendants all along this route are known as Bearas.
The direct descendant of O'Sullivan Beara And my great-grandfather, he was Donal Cam O'Sullivan.
All those people, the only place they ever knew was Beare. And it was their home. They would long to get back home. And I think that once they got across the Shannon, to them it could have been like crossing the Irish Sea, I'm sure. That their despair would have been getting into them. Each mile they passed was further and further away from home. And they could see that there wasn't any great prospects of anything coming out of it.
They were finally in Connacht, and yet the dangers lay ahead. At Aughrim, they met and defeated 800 English with their own tiny forces. It was a huge success. But there was no time for celebration. They marched on, by now starving again as they headed for Slieve Murra, a wooded mound in flat countryside. They hadn't slept or eaten for 36 hours. Next stop, if they could make it, was Glint's Castle, which they hoped to take by force.
Ulick Burke was the landlord here in Glint's at the time of the De Burgo clan, and he obviously got the word that O'Sullivan Beara and his men were coming, and he ordered the local people to gather their food and their cattle and to hide it away. O'Sullivan Beara and his men, on the other hand, having beaten the English in a skirmish at Aughrim, gathered the flags and so on of the English and rode into Glint's, hoping that Ulick Burke would be completely deceived and would give him some food and shelter. But Ulick was not deceived. O'Sullivan decided that they would light bonfires all over the woodland, which they did, and Burke said, well, that's fine, they're going to stay here for the night, so we can wait until morning, we'll catch them when the morning light comes. But O'Sullivan was clever, and he and his men, even though they had lit the fires, sneaked out of the wood and kept on their journey towards Leitrim. And in the morning, when Burke and his men entered the wood, all they found was the ashes.
As they neared O'Rourke territory, the conditions changed. Now the locals were more friendly. Bonfires were lit on the Brickshleaf mountains to show the way for those who struggled this far.
Of Battle of Castle, who were the first clan to come to the rescue and give help and comfort to O'Sullivan Beara when he was marching through here 401 years ago.
After fighting the Battle of Aughrim, they more or less had to run all the way to Mount Mary. They stayed there for a short time, but when they woke in the morning they could see snow for miles around, down to Ord and Castlerea all over. And some of the survivors decided to stay there for a little while, and 400 years later I decided I'd finish the rest of the journey.
The story is told that they killed their last 2 horses as they neared the end of their journey. They ate well that day, and they made shoes for the most lame of the marches. Even with modern aids and proper footwear, this was no picnic for today's walkers. Some fell by the wayside, nursing blisters, shin splints, you name it.
At this stage now, I'm starting to feel a little lonely, like it's the last big walk, it'll be our last night together as a group, and feeling kind of lonely.
They were in sight of the Curlew Mountains now, friendly country. But just to be safe, they skirted modern-day Boyle and travelled north around Lough Arrow, avoiding English patrols.
Walking that ancient path was he, and they laughed and they sang, for no enemies did they meet. Walking to Leitrim with me. Walking to Leitrim, you'll come a walking to Leitrim.
I thought in Cork that, you know, being O'Sullivan Bears territory, that this tradition would still be strong there. But it was incredible to see that the whole way up through Limerick and Tipperary and into Galway then, especially in Roscommon, that this history had obviously remained within the communities for 400 years.
I'd heard the story about the one woman that had made the whole journey, and I had hoped to start at the beginning and see what it was like, just the whole, how did she actually make the whole journey?
My reasons for coming have actually kind of changed since the journey. It was, for me, it was kind of a physical task that I was trying to accomplish, but it became much, much more than that.
When I grew up near the Suck, we were told this story, you know, and it was there in the primary schools and so on. There was a folk memory of it. So I'm just delighted to be involved in the reenactment of it 400 years later.
Some days later, that another group of that had got separated, about 50 more landed, but he got shelter here, and they were taken in and stayed here for some time until he had left his wife and children in safe haven in the hills of Cork, and went back sometime later to get them.
At noon on the 15th day, O'Sullivan Beara arrived into Leitrim with just 16 armed men, 18 attendants, and one woman. The O'Rourkes of Breffni welcomed them like kinsmen and marvelled at the resourcefulness, the courage, and the resilience of the last of the O'Sullivans to make it to Leitrim.
But I'm thrilled to bits that I finished it.
Beautiful, proud, elated, delighted, sad, and everything together.
It must have pained them deeply, like, you know, to think they'd never see Beara again.
It must have been an awful feeling, really. I mean, they'd lived there for generations. Their families were gone and spread all over the country, or either dead, and they knew they never could go home again.
He could have been more of a Taoiseach or an organisation man, and thought of the welfare of his people, because 97% casualty rate is not acceptable in the part of the country where I come from. Maybe 2 shot in a battle is an awful lot. You can make up a song about 2 people and everyone will feel sad. When it comes to losing 1,000 people, those are figures that nobody understands at all.
I think it signified the end of the Gaelic, even though O'Neill and O'Donnell held out for a short while after that it really showed that the English were here to destroy the whole Gaelic system, and they were going to go to any ends they could to do it.